Welcome out to King's Church. So thankful you took some time to be with us on this wonderful Sunday. If we haven't met yet, my name is Matt. I'm one of the pastors here at King's, and we're in the middle of a series called People of the Book. It's a series where we walk through people in the Bible, and we look at their lives and see how they can affect us and speak into our lives today, and how God used ordinary and unqualified people to do great things in his story. And so we've kind of been moving chronologically through different characters in the Bible, and it just so happened that the first four characters were women, and the last four characters we're going to go through are men. And so last week, Pastor Noah transitioned us to talking about the men in the Bible, and so last week was David. If you missed any of the weeks previously, I encourage you to go back and check them out. It's been a great series so far, and today we're going to continue in our conversation called People of the Book. And if you want to catch up, you can go to our podcast, which is King's Church OH. You can search that anywhere that plays podcasts, and you can check it out. So we're going to continue that conversation today around People of the Book. Before we get into it, I just want to pray one more time over this sermon. Lord, we're just so thankful for this Sunday and all that you've done so far in our worship experience, God. And as we continue on and we open up the word today, Lord, I just invite you into this place to speak, Lord, that it wouldn't just be me up here, Lord, with words or phrases, God, but that it would be your word that would be spoken into each person's life right where they're at on their journey. In your name, amen. So standing in the Miami airport, it was me, my wife, my brother and his wife, and my two other brothers, and my mom and dad. Before we had any kids, we were on this family vacation. At this point in time, I was in the music industry. I was playing music, and we were on our way back from a family vacation. We were in the Miami airport. We were transitioning there to another plane where we were going to go fly back to Cleveland. And the very next day, someone had booked our band to play their wedding. And we weren't really like a wedding band, like it wasn't really something we had ever done before, but this couple had reached out to us and they said, hey, we want you to play our wedding. We love your music. In fact, the guy that proposed to his wife, he played our music while they were getting engaged. It was her favorite song, and so they asked us to play, and we were like, man, I don't know. We've never really done weddings before. It's not really something we do. And then they told us how much they wanted to pay us to do it, and we were like, we do weddings now. So we're in. We'll be there. So it just synced up perfectly with the vacation that we were going on as a family. So we were flying back to Cleveland. The very next day, we had to drive to New Jersey to play this couple's wedding. And so we're in Miami, and we get there, and as we land, we kind of learned about the weather patterns that were going on in America at that time. There was a huge storm coming through the Midwest across the East Coast, and they were canceling all the flights that were going from Miami anywhere near Cleveland. And so we just kind of had this moment where we were like, okay, this isn't good. Like, we're going to have to figure this out. And so we kind of look up at the board, and it's just like canceled. All the flights in red canceled. We're like, this is not going to go well. We need to get back for this wedding. We can't let these people down. Like, could you imagine on your wedding day if the band didn't show up because they were stuck in Miami because they were on vacation? And so we're like, all right, so we're going to split up. Half of us were going to go to the ticketing desk where the gate where we were supposed to get on our flight to Cleveland. The other half of us were going to go to customer service. And by the time we got to our gate, it was just a super long line. And my dad and I, we ran to customer service, and it was just packed, all these people. And we were like, this is not looking good. I don't know if we're going to make it back for this wedding. What are we going to do? And so we're standing there, my dad and I, at the back of the customer service line. He's on the phone. We're waiting in line. The other part of our group that were at the ticketing desk, they were waiting in line. They were on the phone with customer service trying to get a flight back to Cleveland, and it just seemed like no one was going to get out of this airport. And all of a sudden, I look up, and on the screen, there's one flight that says on time. I don't even know how this is possible, but it was a flight to Detroit. And if you know this, you probably know that Detroit's about 2 hours away from Cleveland. And so I thought to myself, if we can get on that flight to Detroit, we can rent a car, we can drive through the night, get to Cleveland, meet up with the rest of the band, and then make it to this wedding. And so I'm like, Dad, look, there's one flight. There's one flight that's on time. So he's like, call everyone that's at the ticketing desk. Tell them to get over to that gate right now, C7, right now. So I call them like, everyone get to C7. We're going to try and get on this flight to Detroit. So we run to this desk, and there's not really anyone there that's like waiting in line. We're like, this is such a strange moment. Like, no one's here. No one's trying to get on this flight. And so we walk up, and there's this old Latino guy who's standing behind the desk. And we're like, hey, is there any way that we can get on this flight? There's 8 of us. And he's like, oh, I don't know. He's like, it's very crazy right now. I don't know if I can do it. And we were like, well, my dad's like, well, if you could just get two of us on. He's like, if you could just get my brother is the lead singer of our band, and there was two of us. And he's like, if you could get them on the plane, that would be great. That would be amazing. He's like, maybe, hold on. So then he starts typing on his computer, and he goes through this process with us. He goes, oh, I might have two. And he pauses. He said, no, I don't have any. And he goes, wait, how many did you say? 8. There's 8 of us. Oh, I might have 8. Hold on, I might have 8. And I'm like, what is going on? This guy's computer. Like, just some kind of like war going on between customer service people across the country trying to like get these seats on this flight. So he keeps going. I'm like, maybe 6, maybe 4, no, 2. I could do 2, maybe. So my dad just slowly leans in and he goes, hey, I'll give you $200 cash if you can get us all on this plane right now. And he pauses and he looks up and he goes, I have 8 seats. So he's like, give me your boarding passes. He takes our old boarding passes, changes them out for new ones, and in a matter of seconds, we're on this flight. And so it's like this flight is boarding. It's about to leave. We're the last ones to make it on this flight. And so we start to get on the flight, and my dad goes to do like the interchange. He's like, is this going to go down? Like I said I was going to do it, and are you on it? And the guy, but I don't know if I can give it in front of everyone. Like we could maybe get in trouble. So this guy grabs my arm, and I'll never forget what he said. He grabs my dad's arm, and he says, give it to me in the hallway. And so he pulls my dad in this hallway that says employees only. We get on the plane, and my dad's like not getting on the plane. Like we're waiting there, like the doors haven't shut. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like he got caught and got in trouble. Something happened. And all of a sudden he appears and he's like, it worked. We made it. We made it on the plane. And I'll never forget that line, give it to me in the hallway. So to this day, people will say like, hey, I have something I have to give you. And I'm like, sweet, give it to me in the hallway. I do this regularly to people, and they'll be like, what are you talking about? I'm like, it's a long story. We'll just keep moving. And there's this moment where, for us, we were standing in an airport terminal, and there was one way for us to get to the place that we needed to go. And I wonder if you've ever been at that place in your life. Maybe you felt like you were standing in an airport terminal, and there was a flight you felt like God had called you to be on. But maybe for you, you missed the flight. Have you ever been in a moment like that? Have you ever been in a moment where for you, it was like you were standing in an airport terminal, looking out the window at the flight that you thought you were supposed to be on, and it took off without you? I know there's been moments in my life where I've been in that moment, where from everything that I could tell, from all the understanding that I had, it was that there was a place that God was calling me to go, but it seemed like life wasn't going the way that I had planned or the way that I thought it was supposed to go. And there's a person in the Bible whose life is a lot like that, and his name is Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet. And if you don't have any context for the Bible, maybe you're new to faith, prophets, the simplest definition of a prophet is someone who received a message from God for God's people. And so Jeremiah was a prophet who was called to prophesy to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. At this point in the history of Israel, they had split into 2 kingdoms, and there was the northern part of Israel, which was called Israel, and the southern portion, which was called Judah. And Jeremiah was the last prophet who was called to prophesy to the nation of Judah before they were taken into exile by the nation of Babylon. And so what happened in this moment of history is that the people had completely rejected God. They had turned their back on God. They had worshipped foreign idols, and they had rejected God's ways. And so part of the role of a prophet wasn't just to talk about the future, what was to come, but part of their job was to accuse the leaders of Israel and the people of Israel of turning their back on God and to call them back into a relationship with God. And so for 40 years, Jeremiah spent his time in his ministry calling out the nation of Israel for the sins that they had committed and calling them back to a relationship with God. And what's interesting about Jeremiah's life is that he had almost zero success throughout all 40 years of his ministry. He just had a rough life. I'm going to be honest with you. We're going to talk for like another 30 minutes, and we're just going to talk about how difficult Jeremiah's life was. It was not easy, but I think there's something profound that we can see in his life and how he was able to continue to stay faithful to who God called him to be, even when his life didn't go the way that he wanted. And so the nation of Israel had just come apart at the seams. Their moral fiber had disintegrated. They were accused by Jeremiah of abandoning justice, of oppressing the poor, of forgetting the widow, and eventually engaging in pagan worship like child sacrifice. It actually got to the point in Jeremiah chapter 5 where God says this to Jeremiah. He said, "Go up and down the streets of Jerusalem. Look around and consider. Search through her squares. If you can find but one person who deals honestly and seeks the truth, I will forgive this city." This is the people that Jeremiah was called to. And it was also the people that he loved. It was his nation. It was his people. And he's famous for being nicknamed the weeping prophet because he wept over the fact that the people rejected God's message to them to turn back from their ways. And so I want to take a moment. I want to begin at the beginning of Jeremiah's life. In Jeremiah chapter 1, where God calls Jeremiah to be a prophet. And this is what we read as God begins to engage a conversation with Jeremiah. And this is Jeremiah writing about his conversation with God. Jeremiah chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak, for I'm too young. I love this in this moment. Jeremiah is like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know how to speak, and I'm too young. And then I love the follow-up that God has for him. He says, but the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. Or in other words, don't focus on that, because you are kind of too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. And if I'm Jeremiah at this point, I'm like, can we just take a quick time out? I just have two quick questions about what you just said, God. One, who am I supposed to be afraid of, and why would I have to be afraid of them? Like, what's about to go down? And two, rescue me from what? Like, this is like a foreshadowing that, like, things aren't going to grow great for Jeremiah as he steps into the calling that God has for him in his life. And then the conversation ends with this. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And I want you to remember that last sentence because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. But being a unique prophet, we see Jeremiah's heart kind of out on his sleeves when he writes in the book of Jeremiah. He wrote the book of Jeremiah, which is 52 chapters, and he wrote the book of Lamentations. And in these two books, you see Jeremiah's heart, and this is why he gets the nickname of the weeping prophet. This is his heart for his people as he's prophesying to them, say, turn back, come back, change your ways, come back to God. In Jeremiah 4:19, this is his heart. He says, my heart, I writhe in pain. My heart pounds within me. I cannot be still. For I have heard the blast of enemy trumpets and the roar of their battle cries. It's this moment where Jeremiah can see the message that God is giving him. He knows that the people are going to reject his words and they're going to be taken into exile by God. And at this point in the story, you might be like, man, that's a super downer. Like, guess what? It's going to get a little bit worse. So we're going to keep going, and it's going to get worse for Jeremiah. Because what ended up happening was not only did they reject Jeremiah's message to them, but they ended up oppressing him. Violence came back towards Jeremiah. He was thrown in stockades. He was thrown in jail. They ended up throwing him in a pit and left him to die. And it was one person that felt like they needed to go get him out of that pit, and he was saved out of that pit. But not only did he see his people rejecting God's word, and he saw the future where they were going to move into exile, but he was rejected by his own people, and they actually tried to kill him. And the thing that was remarkable to me throughout Jeremiah's life is that I kept asking myself this question as I studied his life and I studied the things that he went through. I kept thinking to myself, how did you stay faithful to what God had called you to do? In the midst of some of the darkest moments of Israel's history, in the midst of a life that saw almost zero success in seeing Israel turn back to God, how did you stay faithful to what God had called you to do when life wasn't going your way? I think that's a question that we can ask, because if I could interview Jeremiah, if I could just bring him back from the dead and ask him one question, I'd say, how did you stay faithful? In the midst of everything you went through, how did you stay faithful to what God had called you to do? Because I don't know about you, but there's been moments in my life where my faith and the experiences I had didn't seem to line up. And the cool thing is that I think based on the life that Jeremiah lived, the writings that he left us, and the events that he went through in his life, I think that we can answer that question today. So I'd like to take a moment, and I'd like to look at and talk about the idea of how do you stay faithful to what God's called you to do when life doesn't go your way. And I want to answer that question by looking at one of the darkest moments of Jeremiah's life. It's going to get worse, I told you. I warned you. So there's a moment where he's prophesying, and he's prophesying in Jeremiah chapter 20. And one of the chief priests, one of the leaders of Israel, takes him because he doesn't like what he's saying, and he throws him into a stockade. He locks him up, and he leaves him in the middle of the city the entire day, throughout the night. The next day, he lets him go. And Jeremiah has this moment where he's, metaphorically speaking, standing in a terminal, looking out the window, watching the plane leave, thinking to himself, this isn't how I thought this was going to go. And he has a complaint to God. And I want to read you the complaint that Jeremiah has, and then I want to look at the life that he lived and see how we can stay faithful even when life doesn't go our way. Jeremiah chapter 20. This is Jeremiah talking to God. He says, you deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say I will not mention his word or speak anymore in his name, his fire is in my heart. His word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. I hear many whispering, terror on every side. Denounce him. Let's denounce him. All my friends are waiting for me to slip, saying, perhaps he will be deceived, then we will prevail over him and take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior. So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonor will never be forgotten. Lord Almighty, you who examine the righteous and probe the heart and mind, let me see your vengeance on them. For to you I have committed my cause. Sing to the Lord, give praise to the Lord. He rescues the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. And then he goes into a whole other section where he regrets the day that he was ever even born. And he finishes in verse 18 where he says, why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow and to end my days in shame? It's like a super bummer, right? Like, just put that verse back up there, verse 18. It's like, that's just Jeremiah's life in one sentence right there. It's just like, why was I ever even born to experience this depth of sorrow and shame? And in this moment, what happens is Jeremiah says to God, he's like, everyone's abandoned me. I prophesy this future that's coming to Israel, and violence comes my way. My friends have abandoned me. They hope that I slip up so that they can destroy me. But then in the middle of that, he has this moment of hope in verse 13. Where he says, sing to the Lord, give praise to the Lord. He rescues the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. And it's sandwiched in between these complaints that he has, these laments that he has, this sorrow that he has for what's going on in his life. And I think the question for us is, how do you stay rooted in your faith when life doesn't go your way? And the first thing you have to do is that you have to have God as your foundation. That God must be the foundation of your faith. Because I don't know about you, but in my life, being in the music industry, I met so many people who at one point in their life had faith, but at some point it slipped through their fingers. And for them, a lot of times it came down to the fact that their faith didn't measure up to the experiences that they had. And there seemed to be this gap between what they believed God could do and what they actually experienced in their life. And they were left with so many questions. And I don't know about you, but there's been moments in my life where I've just been left with so many questions on my faith journey. Like, I'm going to leave this life and go into heaven with questions that are unanswered. It's just a part of our faith journey. I'm going to walk into heaven and I'm going to say, God, why did you allow my grandmother to suffer under the weight of Alzheimer's? I don't understand. For you, maybe there's been moments and seasons in your life where you've been left with questions that you didn't have answers. And you, like Jeremiah, were standing in a moment where you were looking up to God saying, I don't understand. See, but for Jeremiah, he had answered this one important question. Because there's a lot of questions out there that you're going to need answers to, that you're going to want answers to, and some of them you won't get answers to. But there's one question that I found to be the most important question in my life, which is this: is God trustworthy? For me, I've found the answer to that question to profoundly be yes. And I think that Jeremiah had that answer as well. Because for me, a lot of the questions fade away when life gets really difficult. A lot of the questions of how this works and God, where are you in this? A lot of them fade away. And there's one question that has stuck out in the most darkest moments of my life. And there's this question: God, are you trustworthy? And there has to come a moment in your life where you come into contact with the God who can prove himself to be trustworthy to you. That even in the midst of Jeremiah's darkest moment, he's been rejected by Israel, there's violence coming his way, he's able to stand and say, sing to the Lord, give praise to the Lord. He rescues the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. Even in the midst of his darkest moment, he has this foundation. And so your foundation must be in your relationship with God, in your personal relationship with God, not in a song that you hear on Sunday, not in a sermon that you hear, not in a preacher, not in your small group. Because I don't know about you, there's been moments in my life where I've come to church on Sunday and it's like, yes, this is amazing. This song's great. This song's speaking to me. Driving to work, this song is speaking to me, God's speaking to me. But then that song gets old. And you got to find the next song. Or maybe you followed a preacher that you loved and that preacher had a moral failing. And you had a moment in your life where your faith maybe wasn't rooted in God, it was rooted in something else. Some accessory to our faith. And don't get me wrong, the songs are important, the sermon's important, the preachers, I hope, are important. They're a huge part of our faith, but the foundation of your faith, in order for you to make it through the most difficult moments of your life, needs to be in your personal relationship with the God who is trustworthy. And for me, there's moments in my life where I was in a hole like Jeremiah was, and I saw that God reached down his mighty hand into my story and pulled me out. And so there'll be moments in your life where you have questions. You have a lack of understanding. But if your foundation can answer this one question, I have found God to be trustworthy. You can stay true to what God has called you to do. So one of the most profound statements in the Bible, in the midst of Jeremiah's struggle and his difficulty, he says, but if I say I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his fire is in my heart. His word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. That he falls back on this calling that God has in his life, that he knows God is trustworthy and that he will deliver him so he can step into the most difficult moments of his life. So you have to embrace God as your foundation. And the second thing you have to do is you have to embrace sadness and disappointment. As hard as it is, you need to embrace the sadness and different disappointment that come in your life. Because if you pay attention online, other preachers, even preachers on this stage will say this sometimes because it's true, is that your breakthrough's coming. And a lot of times, if you're not careful, that'll just be the main message that comes forward, is that your breakthrough is coming. We say things like, your best is yet to come, right? We sang it in a song today. And the awesome thing is that's actually true. We actually believe that our faith is rooted in Jesus. And the hope that we find in Jesus is that one day Jesus will come back and rule over heaven and earth, and that his kingdom will bring a rule that will have no end, and that there will be an end of sickness and death and pain and suffering. And so we can believe that our best is yet to come. But I think that sometimes people have not trained us and taught us, how do you live believing your best is yet to come when in reality your worst has just arrived? Have you ever been in that moment? And so what happened to me and to so many of my friends that lost their faith is there was a moment where they had their faith and they had their experience and they didn't match. They didn't know how to move forward, so they thought, it must not be real. But for you and for me, if we're actually able to embrace the sadness and disappointment in our life, it's in that space that we can most profoundly experience God's hope. And so Jeremiah also wrote Lamentations, which might be the most depressing book in the Bible. I encourage you to go read it. You will definitely cry. Preparing for this message, I read it straight through, and I was just crying. I'm like, this is just tough, man. This dude had a rough life. And it's basically 5 chapters of Jeremiah lamenting. It's written in the literary style of a Hebrew funeral song. He's just lamenting about the reality that his people have been taken into exile, and they're lost, and God has rejected them because of their sin, and they refuse to come back to him. And he's lamenting over the reality of what him and the people that he loved are experiencing. And the way that this book ends is extremely depressing. So we're going to read it, and then we're going to talk about it. Lamentations 5:19 through 22. This is how the end of the book of Lamentation is written. You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. And that's the end of Lamentations. Isn't that so sad? And the reason that I find great comfort in that verse is because it's just an honest moment of where Jeremiah is at that point in his life. And the reason I love that is because it gives me great courage, because a lot of my days have ended that way. How about you? There's been seasons in my life where I laid my head down on the pillow at the end of the day and I said, God, are you going to show up? I'm not sure. And that was the close of that day. And I love that God in his divine wisdom and in his will and in his sovereignty included this in the scriptures for us so that we could see that it's okay to have those moments. where you don't know. Where you don't know how God's going to show up. You don't know what the next step is. You're confused. You have questions. It's okay to embrace that moment. Lamentations is the declaration that you can be sad. You can be disappointed. You can lament to God. Because the beautiful thing is that Lamentations might be the end of Lamentations, but it's not the end of God's story. That was just the end of that chapter in the scriptures. And so you might lay your head down one night, and the best description of your life might be the end of Lamentations, where you're like, God, I know you're good, but I don't know if you're going to show up. And what happens is that when you embrace sadness and disappointment, you are then able to experience God's hope. In your darkest moments is when you can experience the profound nature of what hope actually looks like. Which brings us to the last thing. When you're able to embrace sadness and disappointment, it's there that you're truly able to embrace God's hope. Because exile wasn't the end of the story for the people of Israel. That God in the future was going to bring them back to himself out of exile. And that the story where their darkest moment played out and Jeremiah got to sit front row to it, that's not the end of the story that God was writing in their history. Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, a Hebrew scholar, wrote this in his commentary about Jeremiah about the power of exile. He said this, "The suffering of exile is for the Old Testament the matrix in which the hope of God is most powerfully and characteristically at work. The exile is the place where God's faithful promises work a profound newness, nowhere in this more passionately voiced than in the tradition of Jeremiah. Thus, the completed tradition anticipates Paul in the New Testament in Romans 5:3-5 when he says, suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. That Jeremiah was able to stand in his sadness and his disappointment, write an entire book about it, and still stay faithful to his relationship with God because he knew that at the core, that God was the type of God who would deliver the needy from the hand of the wicked. And when he was able to step into that moment and live in that moment, it's in that space that there was this profound hope that came for the Israelites. Jeremiah, the book, is about 52 chapters, not about, literally, 52 chapters long, and there's about 3 chapters of hope. It's almost all doom and gloom. It's just a bummer. But there's a moment of hope where God spoke about what he would do in the future for his people. And it's Jeremiah 31:33-34. He says this, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time," the exile, declares the Lord. "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." That even in the midst of Israel rejecting God and his judgment and his justice coming on them, that there was always a future where God was going to create hope for them. And it kind of functions like a wildfire. A lot of times we see wildfires on the news and we see them as bad things. Because what happens so many times is wildfires will enter into our neighborhoods and they'll tear down our homes and our businesses, and we see them as this dangerous thing. But in their natural habitat, wildfires are actually a good thing. What happens when a wildfire runs through a forest is that it burns up all the things that don't need to be there, all the dead wood that's there, all the plants that have overgrown that are stopping new trees from growing. And actually, one of the healthiest things for a forest is to have a wildfire move through it. There was actually a study done on wildfires by a research station in Tallahassee, Florida. A 23-acre swath of land was not allowed to burn for a specific period of time. And in that time frame, plant diversity fell by 90%, and one species of bird, of woodpecker, disappeared entirely. In order to thrive, this ecosystem, like many others, needed fire. And it's this reality that sometimes each one of us in our lives, we might need to go into a place of exile. God might need to have a conversation with you where he does some things in your life, where you can burn away the things in your life that don't need to be there anymore. Because it's after the wildfire is over that new life can come. And it's the same thing for the Israelites, that God was going to move them into exile. But see, Jeremiah was confident he was able to stand firm because he knew how the story was going to end. That in that time, that God would bring them to himself. And that there's a future that we can plant our hope in At the darkest moments of our life, we can experience God's profound hope that there is just the beginning of the future that God is going to create for us. That the future is more beautiful than anything we could imagine when God steps into it. And so the end of the book of Lamentations is not the end of the story. The unanswered question is not the end of the story. The unanswered prayer request is not the end of the story. Your pain and confusion and wandering and brokenness and mistakes and past are not the end of the story. God's story is the story where new life is always springing forth. It's interesting because the book of Lamentations, right in the middle, there's this small moment, this small glimpse of hope, right in the middle of Jeremiah lamenting about what him and his people are experiencing. This is what he writes. In the middle of the darkest moment of Israel's history, in the darkest moment of his life, he says, "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." And so for you, you might be in one of those moments in your life. Maybe you recently have been, or maybe you're about to be in one and you don't know about it yet, where you're standing in an airport terminal, looking out the window, watching as the flight left that you thought you were supposed to be on, and from your perspective, life isn't going how you thought it was supposed to go. And when you look into the life of Jeremiah, what you can discover is that there is a hope in that moment that can come, that the future begins in that moment. When we commit ourselves to God, when we seek the Lord, and when we do that, we can hold on to our faith, we can hold on to our calling, we can hold on to the future that God has for us, even when life doesn't go our way. Let's pray. Lord, we're just so thankful that you included Jeremiah's life in the scriptures, that we could see a person who was disappointed, who was struggling, who didn't have life go their way, so that we could have a pattern for how we can stay true to our faith in our lives when life doesn't go our way, Lord. And I just pray right now, God, that each person in their life, wherever they're at on their journey, no matter what they're going through, that right now you would just begin to speak with them, Lord. To speak into their situation, into their life, into their struggle, into their suffering, into their difficulty, Lord. That you would speak into it, Lord. You know what they're going through. You know the groans that they've had that they haven't even been able to put into words, Lord. And I just pray right now that you would meet them in that place. Speak to them profoundly, God. And that as we step out of this place and we go on with our lives, that when we come to those moments in time when our faith doesn't match up to our experience, Lord, that we would be able to be rooted in who you are, Lord. That as we embrace the sadness of that moment, that your hope would spring forth into new life for us, God. And with every head bowed and every eye closed as we're sitting here, maybe for you, you've had a moment where you felt you were distant from God. Maybe you're here and you've never actually given your life to God. That you've never taken that step to say, I believe that Jesus came to give his life for me so that I can have the kind of life that the scriptures describe. And if that's you today, I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to that. Maybe you're here today and you want to give your life to Jesus, whether it's for the first time, or maybe you want to recommit your life to Jesus. If that's you, I just want to lead you in this prayer. It's a really simple prayer, and you can just repeat this prayer after me, and I'll invite everyone to say it as kind of a celebration. Just say these words. Jesus, I give you my life. I recognize that you came for me. You came to die for me so that I could have the life that God desires for me. Today, I'm all in. No turning back. Amen.